Hello trainers and welcome to my Pokemon Go PvP catching guide. In this guide we'll talk about everything you need to know about catching moves in PvP, from predicting when your opponent might throw a charge move to techniques like waiting a turn to prevent your opponents from catching your moves. Now, if you're unsure what a catch exactly is or how much of an impact it can have, as an introduction, let's take a look at this clip from the 22 Pokemon Go World Championships.
Unfortunately, Venusaur has been taken out of the match, but Dancing Rob has plenty of options against the Shadow Nidoqueen. Swampert able to hit it super effectively, and the Stunfisk switching in to take the Earth Power from that Nidoqueen. What a play!
Dancing Rob's instincts took over as he sends out the Stunfisk, and now the Swampert is clear to dominate this matchup. What a clutch play.
So, as you can see, not only can a catch change the outcome of the game, when it works it's also one of the most satisfying tricks to pull off. Now, from the clip or from prior experience it should be pretty clear what a catch is, but just to have a clean definition, a catch is when you make a swap at the same time that your opponent throws a charge move, so that the charge move lands on a different Pokemon than your opponent intended. Catches are also sometimes referred to as sacrificial swap, or sex swap for short, when you make the swap with the intention of preserving the Pokemon that is currently on the field by sacrificing a different Pokemon. And what exactly are the situations where you might want to make such a catch? The most common example is just as you have seen in the clip. You and your opponent are racing to a decisive charge move at the end of the game. Your opponent slightly outpaces you, but you still have a different Pokemon with low health remaining, so you catch their charge move on your low health Pokemon, so that your healthy Pokemon can knock out their Pokemon instead, so you win instead of losing. However, a catch can also be done at the beginning or at the middle of the game, where you might just want to catch a move where it is less effective. A good example for this would be catching an Earthquake on a flying type Pokemon. And while these situations are slightly different, they both have the same bottom line. What you want to do with a catch is you want to make your opponent waste the energy to gain an advantage. And how big is that advantage you can gain by making a catch? Well, if you think about a catch at a basic level, is what you do, you make your opponent waste the energy for one charge move that then deals no damage to the target your opponent had. So you can think of the catch as having an extra shield. Now, if you think about your typical PvP match, if it's a pretty neutral matchup, the chances are the match will be pretty even between you and your opponent, and having one extra shield just makes a difference between winning and losing. However, there's always the chance that you run into a heavily alignment-based matchup. For example, if you have a Noctowl up against a Bastiodon, you might be able to catch a Stone Edge, but the Bastiodon won't care at all and just continue to fully smack down the Noctowl. So generally, having a third shield does sound pretty powerful. Just keep in mind, just because you are good at catching, it doesn't mean that you will always have a third shield. First, not in every match there will be the opportunity to make a catch, and even if there is, not every catch will be successful. Also, not every catch is a full extra shield. For example, if you catch on a low health Pokemon, your opponent might be able to undercharge and not knock out, and then be able to gain some of the energy back. So in that case, your catch is only half an extra shield, so to say. So basically, the better you are at catching, the more likely you are to have an extra shield, and also the better you are at preventing your opponent from making a catch, the less likely your opponent is having an extra shield. So you could say the better your catching is, the better the shield ratio in the overall match will be in your favor. So overall, it is a pretty useful technique, but it's not more important than the basics. So before you go and try to catch every charge move your opponent throw at you, first you want to be able to craft teams that somewhat make sense and cover its weaknesses pretty well. You want to be able to at least somewhat read your opponent's lines, and to some extent know the matchups to know what you can and what you cannot win without making a catch potentially. So in the end, it's not a magic technique that immediately puts you from veteran to legend level. However, it is pretty useful. It can make the difference between winning and losing. So we'll talk about everything you need to know to master those catches. Just a couple of things before we dive into the details. Because catching is such a big topic, this guide will be split into multiple parts. So today we'll mostly have an introduction into the world of catching and talk about energy management actually. Because to make good predictions when your opponent might throw a charge move, you should have a pretty good idea of energy management first. In the later parts we'll then talk about how to actually catch, how to prevent your opponent from making catches, how things are different when you and your opponent have different fast move lengths, and also special techniques like waiting a turn to prevent catches. Also, quick shout out to Thought Tactical, Inadequance, King IV and Freaka, who all took a look at the script to make sure everything that needs to be covered is covered in this guide. So now that that's out of the way, let's start with the basics. So in general, what do you need to make a catch? And essentially a catch has three main components, and those are the prediction. You need to predict when your opponent will throw the charge move. The timing, you need to make the swap at the same time that you predict the charge move to be thrown, which becomes a problem when you and your opponent have different fast move lengths. And the third part is the target. You need a target to catch the move on. So if you remember the clip from the beginning, if you want to catch a decisive Earth Power at the end of the game on a low health Stunfisk, that low health Stunfisk doesn't magically appear in your line of 3. At some point in the battle you have to swap it out to be able to swap it back in later. So out of these three, the prediction is both the most important and the most difficult part to master, so that is what we'll talk about the most. And this prediction also has a preparational part that is not strictly required, but it does help a lot, and that is determining when your opponent reaches a charge move. Quick note here, because I will be using PvPoke for this and some other visualizations, so if you're unfamiliar with that site, each square represents a fast move, the top line represents your Pokemon, the bottom line represents your opponent's Pokemon, and each circle represents a turn where you can or do throw a charge move, and everything else is an edit. And that is only the preparation, because people don't always throw charge move as soon as they become available. And yeah, determining when your opponent reaches a charge move, it can either be done by just knowing the counts or making an estimate if you have some kind of idea what the counts might be, or if you don't count at all, you just make a complete guess when that might be the case. Now, regardless if you know the counts or not, having a good estimate when your opponent reaches a charge move is actually the easy part. And what makes the actual prediction so difficult is that there are a lot of factors that might influence your opponent's decision when they will actually throw the charge move. For example, if their charge move KOs or not, or if it's on the lead on the final matchup on the game. However, the first key distinction we have to make here is how experienced the player is you are up against. So if you're up against an unexperienced player, they tend to be somewhat unpredictable, especially at the beginning of the game or generally in slow matchups. So sometimes they will throw the charge immediately, sometimes they will overfarm a little bit, sometimes they will go up to 100 energy or even over, because they often don't have a clear game plan and just throw the charge move when they feel like it. However, when you're closer to the end of the game or just to the end of a singular matchup, they are much more likely to throw their charge move immediately when they think the charge move will KO, because they are often just concerned with removing the Pokemon that is currently opposing them on the field as quick as possible without having an eye for their potential overall win conditions. In contrast, the more experienced a player is you are up against, the more optimized their gameplay will typically be, which means that even if they have a charge move that can knock out your current Pokemon, they often won't throw it immediately, but rather overfarm some energy to gain an advantage into the next matchup. Now, this optimized gameplay style follows certain rules, which makes it somewhat predictable, which also helps us to make predictions when to make a catch. However, if you think, does this mean inexperienced players are more difficult to play against? This often is not the case, because an optimized, predictable gameplay style typically is more difficult to beat than an unoptimized, unpredictable gameplay style. Now, determining if your opponent is experienced or not is of course an important factor when you want to make your predictions for catches, but before we can understand how to make that distinction, we need to talk about what that optimized gameplay style actually is. And while there are a lot of optimizations that you might have in your gameplay style, the most important one we have to talk about here is having good energy management, because energy management determines your charge move timing, which determines in turn when you can make a catch. So before we dive further into actually catching moves, let's talk about what good energy management can mean. Now, this won't be a complete guide on energy management, because that alone would be a series of multiple videos, but we'll talk about the core concepts that also translate well to catching. And the main concept here is that you typically want to throw a threatening charge move before your opponent can do that. And by threatening, I mean a charge move that either knocks out their current Pokemon or leaves it in a health range where you can gain an advantage, typically by defeating it with fast moves after the charge moves. Now, the first thing you might wonder, just a moment ago I was talking about unexperienced players and how they tend to throw their charge moves immediately if they can KO your current Pokemon. What is the difference here? And the main difference is throwing first doesn't always mean having to throw immediately. And we'll talk about how much later you can throw rather than immediately just in a moment, but first we'll talk about why you want to throw first. And this should be obvious at the end of the game, when both you and your opponent only have one Pokemon remaining. You want to knock out their Pokemon before they can knock out your Pokemon, because then you win. However, this also applies at the beginning of the game, because every shielding decision your opponent has to make leads you a little closer to finding potential win conditions. One good example for this would be the matchup Sableye against Shadow Charizard. From the perspective of Sableye, you are able to reach a foul play just a little faster than the Charizard reaches the Blast Burn. So if you throw the foul play first, if it goes unshielded, you can decide to shield whatever the Charizard throws at you. Regardless if it baits or not, it will always only be able to reach one charge move, so you can just shield whatever it throws at you and gain switch advantage. If the foul play, however, goes shielded, you can then decide how you want to go on with the matchup. So if you have a Lantern in your bag, you might say, okay, I already have a shield advantage, I'm fine with this, I'm letting my Sableye go, and then I can clean this Charizard with my Lantern. If your backline is not that strong against Charizard, you might also decide, okay, I don't want to take damage on my Sableye, I want to preserve it, so after throwing the foul play, I switch out to something like Umbreon, because that is able to tank the potential Blast Burn better. And then there's also the scenario that your backline might be super weak against Charizard, in which case you might decide, okay, I have to fight for switch advantage here. And regardless what your decision is, you are in the driving seat, your opponent already had to spend a shield, so you can decide how you want the match to flow. Now, this example is pretty straightforward because every charge move is threatening. Let's take a look at how things are different when charge moves are not threatening. The matchup we'll be taking a look at here is Lickitung up against Cresselia. In this case, from Lickitung's perspective, you deal a lot of damage with the Licks. However, the Body Slam deal not that much damage because both Lickitung and Cresselia are very bulky Pokemon. Now let's say you do throw a Body Slam immediately, the Cresselia throws a Moonblast and then switches out to a Swampert. Now you are not in the best spot because your Lickitung is almost energy dry, and you might not be able to reach that Power Whips as quickly as you might want because the Body Slam into the Swampert is not that threatening, and the Swampert might be able to throw a lot of Hydro Cannons, and because your Lickitung is not at full health, it might not appreciate those moves as much. Now, if you don't throw your Body Slam immediately, your opponent will be in a much more difficult spot to switch in the Swampert because you pretty much have a Power Whip stored after they had thrown a move with Cresselia, so the Swampert will be much more threatened by potential Power Whips and might not be so comfortable switching in. So generally, if you can threaten with the charge move, you want to throw it first. If you cannot threaten with your charge move, you often want to hold on to your energy because it might be more valuable into a different matchup. And while these two examples should be pretty obvious what is threatening and what is not threatening, it can be a lot more difficult to tell in different matchups. And one example we'll take a look at here is the matchup Pelipper up against Galarian Stunfisk. Now here, the first charge move from either side is not threatening because a Weather Ball deals roughly 40% damage, while a Rock Slide deals roughly 55% damage. So neither Pokemon is able to KO the other Pokemon with fast moves after landing one charge move. And things start to become tricky with the second charge move. Now from Pelipper's perspective, if you throw the second Weather Ball first, it is kind of threatening because the stun whisk will be so low that you can KO it with wing attacks afterwards. However, it doesn't matter if you throw the Weather Ball first or not, the stun whisk will always be able to reach a Rock Slide, which you will have to shield if you want to keep switch advantage. Now let's say you do throw your second Weather Ball immediately and your opponent also throws the second Rock Slide immediately, and then your opponent switches out to a Shadow Charizard. Now you will be only able to reach one Weather Ball before the Charizard fully wing attacks you down, and now you might be in a kind of rough spot depending on your backline because you're up against the Shadow Charizard with a big energy advantage. So in this case it would have been preferable to hold on to the energy of the Weather Ball because then you would have been able to get both shields from the Charizard with two Weather Balls, and which would overall put you in a better spot. However, let's say you do keep onto your energy and instead of a Shadow Charizard your opponent has something like a Lantern in your backline, in which case the energy you have held onto becomes pretty worthless because Pelipper can't threaten a Lantern at all. And in this case you would have preferred to throw the Weather Ball into the Stunfisk, so it becomes kind of important to have a somewhat of a prediction what your opponent might have in the bag to determine whether you hold on to your energy or if you want to throw it immediately. And another factor that can be important here is how well you can farm down the Stunfisk after the Piliput potentially goes down. So if you throw the second weather ball immediately, the Stunfisk will be such in a low health range that even something like a Registeel would be able to calm it down. However, if you only land one weather ball, it will be still in the yellow, and if you don't have anything with fast move pressure on your team, it might be difficult to defeat the Stunfisk afterwards. So in summary, the first key skill that makes good energy management is determining whether a charge move is threatening or not, and if it is, throwing it before your opponent. If it's not, holding on to that energy. Now let's finally talk about what I mean by throwing first rather than throwing immediately. And the key concept to understand here is that whenever you want to throw a charge move, you have a window of opportunity to do so. And this window of opportunity, it starts obviously as soon as you reach your charge move, and it ends when your opponent reaches a charge move. Or to be more precise, if you have a higher attack stat than the opposing Pokemon, you can throw on the same turn that they reach a charge move. If you have a lower attack stat, you have to throw one turn before, because if you throw on the same turn, your opponent will throw on charge move priority and thus throw first. If you're unsure if you or your opponent wins CMP, you have to make a call. Either you play it safe and throw one turn before, or you take a risk and throw at the same time that your opponent reaches the charge move. And to visualize this window of opportunity, we'll take a look at the matchup Galarian Stunfisk against Shadow Charizard. Now let's start with the perspective of Stunfisk. The zero shield scenario is pretty straightforward because you simply outpace the Charizard. You reach Rock Slide after 5 mud shots, while Blast Burn is 7 wing attacks. So if you want to throw a Rock Slide first, you are able to do so after either 5 or 6 mud shots. You don't want to throw after 7 because then the Charizard is also at a Blast Burn and is able to threaten a shield of you. Now, is it better to throw after 5 or 6? If you throw after 5 and for whatever the reason the Charizard does not shield, you win that matchup, but you have 0 energy into the next matchup, which might be slightly uncomfortable if, for example, your opponent brings in their own Stunfisk and you have to make a bait call. If, however, you throw after 6 and also the Charizard does not shield, you have an energy lead of 1 mud shot, which might make the mirror match against an opposing Stunfisk somewhat more comfortable. If the Charizard does shield your Rock Slide, which is very likely, there isn't really a difference. You don't have an disadvantage either way, so it's still, for the possibility that your opponent might not shield, it would be better to throw after 6 mud shots. Now let's switch to the perspective of the Shadow Charizard, and in the zero shield scenario obviously there isn't much you can do, you just lose because you get hit by Rock Slide. But how does it look like if you can invest at least 1 shield? When do you want to throw your Blast Burn or potential Dragon Claw bait? And your window of opportunity here, it of course begins after 7 wing attacks when you reach a Blast Burn, and it ends when the opposing Stunfisk reaches a Rock Slide. And because this Charizard always wins charge move priority against Stunfisk, you can throw on charge move priority. So the window of opportunity ends when the Stunfisk is at 10 mud shots, but because the Stunfisk will already have thrown its first Rock Slide, when the Stunfisk is at 10 mud shots, you are at 11 wing attacks. So your window of opportunity extends from 7 to 11 wing attacks, so it's pretty big. And again, like from Stunfisk's perspective, if you throw after 11 wing attacks as late as possible and the Stunfisk does not shield, you maximize the energy you gain into the next matchup, which can be pretty useful. However, the Stunfisk can shield, and there's one thing you have to consider here, different shielding scenarios, because if you throw after 11 wing attacks and the Stunfisk throws a Rock Slide immediately, you can't switch out after the Blast Burn. You will have to shield another Rock Slide if you want to keep your Charizard alive. However, your strategy might be you want to throw a Blast Burn before the second Rock Slide, in which case you do not want to throw on charge move priority. So in this case you would have to throw after 10 wing attacks, because then the Stunfisk is just not yet at its second Rock Slide, and then you can switch out before having to potentially shield another Rock Slide. There is, however, also one big advantage in throwing at the same time that your opponent reaches a charge move if you have a high attack stat, and that is trying to force charge move priority. And the idea behind that is that you want to trick your opponent into throwing their charge move earlier than they usually would. And why this can work is because your opponent also, of course, has the goal to throw that threatening charge move before you can. And if they're unsure of your energy, if you're at charge move yet or not, they might just think, okay, I think they're not at charge move yet. If I throw immediately, I can throw first. Or they may also think you are unsure of their energy, so they think, if I throw immediately, maybe they think I'm not at a charge move yet and I can surprise them by throwing immediately. So this is why this might work, and what are the advantages of doing this. So first of all, as already explained, like in the general case, if you throw your charge move as late as possible and it knocks out the current Pokemon because it goes unshielded, you maximize the energy you take into the next matchup. If it however goes shielded and your trick of forcing charge move priority works, you minimize the energy your opponent takes into the next matchup. So you get a shield with a blast burn, your opponent wins that matchup. However, if you come in with your own Stunfisk afterwards, the opposing Stunfisk won't have any energy lead, so it will come down to baits rather than the opponent having an energy lead, which might make it very difficult for you. Also, not in this case, but in other matchups, it might be important to maximize the damage you deal with fast moves before you throw your charge move. And if you throw as late as possible on that charge move priority, you maximize the fast move damage, which might just make the difference between KOing or not KOing the Pokemon that is currently on the field. So are there any downsides to trying to force charge move priority? And as already explained, one small downside is that you won't be able to swap out your Pokemon if the attempt works. So in some cases it might be important, in others it might be not that important. Also, because it's a somewhat well-known technique, it's also somewhat likely that your opponent might make a catch attempt when you try to throw on charge move priority. Of course, this downside does not exist if your opponent is switch locked. So let's take a look at some different shielding scenarios in this matchup from Stunfisk's perspective. In the one shield scenario, if you do shield a Dragon Claw bait from the Charizard, you have to throw the second Rock Slide immediately, because one Dragon Claw bait plus a Blast Burn is 11 wing attacks. You reach the second Rock Slide after 10 Mudshot, so if you overfarm only by one Mudshot, the Charizard will already be at a Blast Burn and threaten a shield from you. If you have shield a Blast Burn correctly, the second Blast Burn will be reached after 13 wing attacks total, so your window of opportunity starts at 10 Mudshots and ends after 12 Mudshots. If you successfully call a Dragon Claw bait, this doesn't really change your window of opportunity. You still have to throw the Rock Slide immediately for the biggest advantage, because the Blast Burn will still be reached after 11 wing attacks. You just gain a bigger advantage by having called a bait, but the window does not change because of that. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that if the Charizard maximizes its energy, as I've just described, it might not even throw its first charge move up until you reach your second Rock Slide, in which case it becomes pretty difficult to decide if you want to throw it immediately or not. So let's pretend for a moment that you know that the opposing Charizard is single moved and it can only throw Blast Burns, in which case you obviously do not want to throw your second Rock Slide immediately, even if the opposing Charizard has not thrown any charge moves yet, because it's very likely that the Charizard is just trying to force charge move priority. So you continue overfarming Mudshots up until the Charizard is right before the second Blast Burn, so you can go up to 12 Mudshots. In the normal case, however, that the Charizard has two moves, Dragon Claw and Blast Burn, you kind of have to throw immediately, because it might be a Dragon Claw bait, in which case you have to throw the second Rock Slide immediately. Otherwise, if you do another Mudshot and you shield a Dragon Claw, and then the Charizard is able to throw a Blast Burn immediately after, and then you have to invest both shields, which you typically do not want. So yeah, it can be pretty difficult, and for your window of opportunity, you always have to plan ahead. What if your opponent throws your charge move right now? What if your opponent shields? And so on. You have to keep different scenarios in mind. Just for a moment, let's talk about the two shield scenario from Stunfisk's perspective, and essentially you have to do the math in your head here, how much you can overfarm. If the Charizard baits twice, it reaches the Blast Burn and two Dragon Claws after 15 wing attacks, at the same time that you reach your third Rock Slide, so you won't be able to win that matchup. If the Charizard baits once, it reaches one Dragon Claw plus two Blast Burns after 17 wing attacks, and so on. So yeah, you essentially have to do the math in your head, and of course this can be pretty difficult. So let's talk about what do you do if you're unsure how close your opponent is to a charge move. What do you do? And essentially, when you're unsure about your opponent's energy, what this does is it creates a perceived window of opportunity that might be bigger or smaller than the actual window of opportunity. So let's say you shielded a Dragon Claw bait and a Blast Burn, and you're not sure when you can throw the next Rock Slide. If you know that the Charizard needs 17 wing attacks to reach the next Blast Burn, you can safely throw your Rock Slide after either 15 or 16 wing attacks. If, however, you think maybe it's only 16 wing attacks, your window of opportunity is that you have to throw the rock slide immediately. If you think that it might be 18 wing attacks, however, then there's a very high chance that you might be punished for throwing after 17 mud shots, because then you end up throwing on charge move priority and get KO'd, even though you could have thrown the move earlier. So when you're not sure, it's usually safer to throw the charge move too early rather than too late. Now, I've said a lot of times that you want to throw your charge move as late as possible in your window of opportunity. And while this is very often the case, there are also some exceptions to this rule, so let's talk about those. The most obvious one is that sometimes your opponent might not even need a charge move to KO you, because you have such low health that they can knock you out only with fast move, in which case you of course have to throw your charge move before fast moves knock you out. Also, if you're up against a Pokemon with very high fast move pressure, it might be more important to preserve HP rather than maximizing the energy on your current Pokemon, especially if you know that your opponent does not have such high fast move pressure in the back. So in which case, if you get your Pokemon into the next matchup with high HP but low energy, that might be more advantageous to you rather than having very low HP but having a charge move stored. Another thing that can clip your window of opportunity is the energy cap of 100, because you typically don't want to go over 100 energy. So if you go into the matchup again, Stunfisk against Shadow Charizard, and you have an energy lead of 7 mud shots, you kind of really want to throw your Rock Slide after 4 more mud shots, because then you're at 99 energy, and every extra mud shot is kind of wasted because it deals almost no damage and the energy goes nowhere. So in summary, what makes good energy management? First, it's recognizing when you can gain an advantage by throwing a charge move before your opponent, and if that is the case, recognizing the window of opportunity when you can do so, and typically throwing as late as possible into that window. Now, of course, there's a lot more to good energy management, which unfortunately we can't all talk about today. However, if you understand these two core concepts, you are already in a pretty good spot. So I hope you learned something today, and we'll talk about how to apply this knowledge about energy management to actually catching moves in the next video.